Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Jill Weinstock, and I'm the director of Baxter St. I'm so excited to provide this introduction to this conversation between Curator Drew Sawyer, guest curator Phalguni Gulliani, and artists Marvel Harris and Siddhartha Hajra, discussing their group exhibition, Just Wide Enough to Hold the Weight. Just Wide Enough to Hold the Weight questions what happens when someone has the agency to tell their own story, bringing together new and recent works by Marvel Harris, Siddhartha Hajra, and Soma Sankar-Bose. Curator Phalguni Gulliani builds a presentation that treads the space between self-portraiture and staged dreamscapes. What distinguishes the work of these artists and activates a cross-dialogue between their practices is the self-reflective gaze and the space for collaboration that each enables within their individual inquiry. This exhibition is part of Baxter St's guest curated program and is made possible with the support of the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation. Drew Sawyer is an art historian and curator who holds the title of Philip Leonian and Edith Rosenbaum Leonian Curator at the Brooklyn Museum. He has previously held curatorial positions at the Museum of Modern Art and the Columbus Museum of Art, where he co-founded the Center for Art and Social Engagement through a major grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Phalguni Gulliani is an exhibition maker based in New Delhi, India. She is interested in the inner lives of women and of the ordinary and everyday objects, seeking to explore these through a practice that pirouettes between writing and contemporary curatorial art. Marvel Harris is a photographer born and raised in the Netherlands. Marvel's photographic work revolves around his experience as an autistic, non-binary transgender artist who struggles with mental health problems for many years. Siddhartha Hajra calls himself an instinctual maker of photographs, capturing life as it unfolds before his eyes. For over a decade, he has chronicled the cities of India and those who occupy the margins of it. In this time, he has both attended and facilitated photo workshops with Michael Ackerman, Jonathan Tobovnik, and gender collectives in Calcutta. Unfortunately, Soma Sankar-Bose, the third artist in this three-person exhibition, is unable to join us today as he is traveling. Soma is a photographer from Bengal, India. He graduated from the one-year diploma program at Pasala South Asian Media Institute in Dhaka. His practice, Soma uses photography, archive material, text, film to explore desire, identity, and memory. Thank you again for joining us today as we delve deeper into Just Wide Enough to Hold the Weight. I will now hand it over to Phalguni and Drew. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Baxter, for inviting me for this conversation today. And thank you, Phalguni, and all the artists for bringing this work to New York. So I'll just kick it off with some questions, and then, if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring it, and I can ask as we go along as well. But Phalguni, maybe you want to start us off by just sort of telling us a little bit more about the curatorial premise and how you came to select the work of these three artists in particular. And maybe, I know you have a presentation, so you can sort of walk through the layout of the show, but as maybe the artist's work comes up, they can jump in and talk a little bit about their own practice before opening up to broader questions.
Sure, that sounds like a good idea. Thanks, Drew. Thanks for kicking us off on that note. Thanks, Jill, for that very kind introduction. If I could ask Alex to please share your screen, and then I'll start talking about the work. Thank you. So if you ask me, Drew, to start off on the kind of curatorial impetus for this show, I want to begin by talking about the crack, and why the idea of a crack as a metaphor is really important to my practice. In the work that I do and how I think curatorially with artists, the kind of exhibitions that I'm making, the work that I'm drawn to, I'm very interested in the pregnant moment, right? So the moment on which something is about to happen, a moment that's on the cusp of transformation. It's the moment before a whisper becomes a bang. It's the moment before the silence becomes a scream. It's the moment before day becomes night. So it's these kind of transformative moments that I'm interested in. And it goes back to the idea of my practice lying in interstices, right? Because as curators, we're constantly navigating that interstice between image and text, especially as curators of photography. So as I was thinking about interstices, the crack became a really important metaphor for me. Also to think about how small gestures that we do in the course of our life or in the course of a single day then amplify into larger kind of tectonic ripples, right? So it's a small crack and a small fissure that grows larger and changes something in society. And I know that's tall order, so I don't make that kind of claim for my practice that I'm changing something in society. I'm interested in starting a conversation, right? And because I was looking at that transformative moment between the small gesture and the larger ripple, between the small rupture and the larger ripple, I was also thinking about how meaning is generated and how perception is generated, right? And I was looking at these questions within the medium of photography, which generates photographic meaning, which generates photographic truths. And it's a medium in which there is always the inherent other, right? So somebody who holds the camera and creates truth for that moment. And I know we were talking yesterday also, Drew, about how the camera is instrumentalized. So I was very interested about the othering that the camera does in this active meaning making, right? And because I was looking at this act, I thought, well, what happens when the people who are inside the photograph have the agency to tell their own story? And when I was thinking of that, a question that came to my mind was that in this active meaning making, in this act of building your own perceptions in society, whether that's for an individual or for a group or a gender minority, it's this idea that making your own truth is of course powerful, but sometimes making your own fiction can be an equally powerful way of looking at yourself. Which is why in that introduction that Jill gave just now, she said that this is an exhibition that treads the space between self-portraiture and stage dreamscape. So I wanted to keep that tension very much at the heart of the show, that you don't quite know which image is staged and which is an act of self-portraiture. And because I was looking at the role of fiction in photography and how meaning is created, I thought a good place to begin would be this quote by Ocean Vuong that kind of frames the entrance to the show as well. And here it's taken from an essay poem where he's talking about the suicide of his uncle. The poem is called On Weight of Our Living, On Hope, Fire Escapes, and Visible Desperation. And when he talks about the suicide of his uncle, he talks about how there's a lack of structure, of linguistic structure in our society for people to kind of step outside the weight of their living and kind of unburden themselves. And he likens that to a fire escape, when, say, it's a hot, stuffy night, you want to grab a smoke out of a party, you would go to a fire escape. And the fire escape is both something that's a necessity, especially in hours of crisis, in hours of trauma. It allows that escape. And for me, what's interesting about the architecture of the fire escape as I was reading this poem was that it's both ubiquitous and unnoticeable at the same time in our perception of when we think of these tall buildings in New York. You don't almost register the fire escape visually, right? So again, I wanted to think of that architecture of the fire escape and relate it to the idea of perception, right? And how there can be a small crack in perception that's barely visible, which is the way the fire escape is barely visible in the building. But it's that crack that allows an exit through the weight of that structure. So that's where my thinking about the show started. That's where the poem really comes in and frames the entrance to the show. But I also wanted to talk today about the first line of the poem itself, right? Which says, I still have my body, and with it these words, hammered into a structure just wide enough to hold the weight of my living. And I think for me, curatorially, a good place to begin this exhibition would be the body, And that's why you have that portrait of Marvel right next to the poem. If we could just go to the next slide. Thank you. And that's a portrait where you see Marvel, and Marvel will, of course, chime in a moment here. But, I wanted to begin with this portrait. The exhibition really starts for me here because this is quite an early self-portrait of his, early on in the transition when the project of Inner Journey started. And you see him here really in this backdrop of this vast, mountainous, thorny landscape, right? And it sort of sets the conversation of the space that the body occupies as opposed to this vast landscape. And then you kind of, if we could go to the next image. Yeah. So it's this idea that the space of the body, maybe Marvel, you want to just talk a bit here before I talk about your images a bit.
No, I think it's okay that you continue. I was following the conversation well.
Sure. Maybe we could just go on to Marvel's images and come back to this in a minute. Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with the wall of Marvel's images and how I wanted to, when Marvel and I were in conversation together, we wanted to show how the journey unfolds, and the series is called Inner Journey. So it chronicles both his gender transition as well as the struggles with his neurodivergent kind of a coming of age tale, right? So you see the image beginning with his mother. And if we could go to the next one, please. Thank you. And what you see here in this sequence, what's really interesting to me is a word that's been used for Marvel's work before a lot is rawness. And so there's definitely that quality in these images, but there's also, for me, a lot of tension in the way that he holds the transforming body really closely, right? There's a lot of grip, which then goes to if we could look at the next image, which then goes to ends at this moment of release, right? Where the body lets itself go. So what Marvel's work does for me is that it kind of really plunges you into the deep interiorities of the body. How does the body change? And I know Marvel speaks about his work as his work is about his feelings that are constantly in flux. Maybe Marvel.
Yeah, more about the feelings than about the transition or the bodily transition. Because at first, I actually started taking self-portraits because I lacked examples of people I could identify with myself. And when I was searching for gender transition on Google as an example, I saw a lot of focus on just only the body, but not what it does to you to go into transition mentally. So that was something that I missed and wanted to capture. And when I started to share these images online, people said that I helped them with it. So that's why I started continuing sharing my work online.
Yeah. So I think what's really beautiful about that, because in Marvel's work, for me, there's this acknowledgement that all of our bodies have this inherent nature to change, and all of our psychologies have an inherent nature to change. And you really see that in the photograph where, as I was talking about the pregnant moment, that's kind of on the cusp of happening. And the tension in which he holds the transforming body really brings that to the fore for me. And it really reaches this crescendo with this image of the release. And if we could look at slide 3 of Soumya's work. Yeah, thank you. And Soumya's not here with us today, but I'll try to do justice to his work. For me, you have Marvel's work that kind of takes you in the deep interiorities of the body. And when we were looking at Soumya's work, which is Full Moon on a Dark Night, it's a series of portraits that he has made of his friends who he has known for many years, who identify as LGBTQ. And they're friends who have shared with him their hopes, dreams, anxieties. And a lot of these portraits, they have very active role in deciding how they want to be photographed, where they want to be photographed. So if somebody has a recurring dream or a nightmare about a bathtub, that's the setting that he's chosen to photograph them in, or they have chosen for themselves rather. And since this is quite a large body of work, and we'll see that same, not problem, but we'll see that same idea with Siddhartha, because these are photographers with many years of working on this project. So when we were editing this sequence, Soumya and I, and we said, okay, these are the 8 images we're going to show. One of the things that stood out for me as a curator was the dreamlike quality of Soumya's images. So and how they kind of, and with this sequence, what I wanted to be very conscious of was Marvel's work is taking you deep inside the body. So I wanted to look at the space that the queer body occupies and the space around the queer body. And that kind of thinking was very much a part of my, of why I would choose certain images. And of course, this idea that these are very dreamlike. So the way in dreams, you feel like you're always in the medias res of something. You don't know where the narrative is. It could shift. It could be in, if we could go to slide 4, you could be in the middle of an ocean. And then in the next slide, which you see on the wall as well in the sequence, you could be in a bathtub. You could be in the embrace of your lover one moment, and you could be in the middle of a fantastical zoo looking at a tiger. And for me, the sequence ends with this person waking up from the dream. And that's what you see on slide 6, right? So I was very conscious when working with Soumya's images and when putting this edit together with him, that we deliberately don't tell the viewer where they are and where the narrative is. And that, for me, speaks to the way about the breadth of the experiences and the breadth of kinds of representation that his friends see themselves in at the different spaces the queer body, claims space. And that was very much a part of our thinking. But to present it in this way where the narrative is shifting, it's quite haphazard, it's almost schizophrenic. And that's also speaks to the visual quality of these images. And then from Marvel's work, if we could go to slide number 10. Thank you. So as we're looking at, and these are the 2 walls in the gallery that face each other, right? Where you have this dance of what's happening inside the queer body and what's happening around it. So from that kind of facing walls, I thought we could segue into Siddhartha's work, which is kind of on the central wall of the gallery. You see it a little bit here, but maybe in the next image on slide 11, you really see how that ties in. And Siddhartha, maybe you want to tell us a little about this project and especially, why we chose to display it as a film strip for its cinematic nature. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Phalguni. Thank you, Drew, for your questions. Yeah, as you can see here, there are 2 works on display, but the one that we were referring to, Phalguni was referring to earlier, is called Monorama, Opera Monorama, which is a series of 3 photographs from a larger body of work that I have presented. And before I get to this, these 3 images, I want to talk a little bit about my practice, which probably will help understand the question that Drew asked Phalguni and where I come in with these images. I have always photographed without a project-based approach. I generally tend to not photograph or go about photographing anything with a project in mind, but I go about it. I think I am more instinctual as a photographer. I respond to situations and people as and when they come to me. So, and that helps me kind of free myself from any kind of tags. Sorry, I heard something. No, so I kind of, I don't know what's going on. Yeah, so I was saying that I don't go photographing with a project-based approach, but instead I go about photographing on an instinctual basis, which helps me, come away from the usual pressure of these tags, so-called tags of, this is a project about a gender identity, this is a project about LGBTQ people. And for me, it's more important that who I'm photographing, if I connect to them, that is more important for me. And I see them as kind of an incantations of lives that touch mine. And I see that throughout the whole process of my photography, whether be it opera monorama, whether be it I See You Better in the Dark, which you see also presented here in this gallery. And yeah, this is, and about Monorama, as you can see here, this is one of the performances where she performs as a goddess in community spaces in the east of Eastern India. And she invited me into these performances herself. And these images have come from a lot of time spent with her. And the time I spent with her is also allows for me to build this trust, which is what actually allows me to photograph and to allow the camera to, to have this conversation going. It's from the conversation of trust and photography. I believe it is based on trust, and it is based on these kind of conversations, which is based again on time. And it frees me from these project approach and narratives, and it frees the narratives for me, and it unfolds on its own. And I like that fascinating. I like that fascinating aspect of photography, when you go about photographing somebody or something, and you don't know what is going to come next to you. And I always honor that in my practice.
Yeah. Thanks, Siddhartha. If we could just stay on the monorama image for a while. Thank you. So, thanks for that, because with your work, what I see as such a moving thing is that, like you said, these are incantations of lives that have touched yours. So when you say that you don't have a project-centric approach, the way for me, why that was interesting as a curator is because, of course, this depicts the life of a transgender person. Of course, this is set in a vernacular, very regional context, but the work both is about that and is not about that, right? And as we were speaking yesterday also in our call, Drew, when we were speaking about Guibert, and who you have, of course, worked so much on, about how he said that somebody said to him that your stories ooze homosexuality. And he said, well, how can they not? If I wasn't including that, I would be writing carelessly. And it's something that I think is very important for me, for all photographers in this show, is that for them, the question of gender is very much at the heart of the work that they're doing. But at the same time, as Siddhartha said, he was much more driven by the fact that this was such an operatic, mesmerizing world that he was invited to, that he kept returning to for a period of more than 10 years now. I mean, some of the images that we see here, both in the next series that he presents, are from way back as 2010. So the fact that, this is an ongoing conversation and it continues, and gender is only a door through which we enter that conversation, through which we enter the very intimate lives of these people, is interesting for me. And, because we really wanted to highlight, I mean, curatorially, when we were thinking of the display, we wanted to highlight, of course, she's a performance artist, and these images have this very theatrical quality to them. So our decision to show it as like a film strip, where the narrative, like Siddhartha said, is continuously building on itself, that's where that came from. And what it did for me in the exhibition space is that it allowed to transition between, this, like I said, the dance of the queer body, the space inside of the body and outside of the body, from that way of looking at yourself to looking at somebody you're very intimately close with, as Siddhartha is with Monorama for more than a decade now, right? And if we could go to the next work, thanks. And continuing this conversation of speaking to someone, of looking at someone who you're very close to, we look at this other work of Siddhartha, slide number 14, if you could please. Thank you. So this work is called I See You Better in the Dark. It comes from the title of an Emily Dickinson poem. These are images built in a participatory storytelling workshop that Siddhartha conducted with gender minority communities in Eastern India. And maybe Siddhartha, you want to talk to us a little bit about just that title, I See You Better in the Dark, and where that comes from for you.
Thank you, Phalguni. Yeah, so the title of this work, I See You Better in the Dark, came from this Emily Dickinson poem, and where she talks about seeing her lover better in the dark. And that question that raised from that, reading that line and reading what it is about, made me question how, when we are dealing with photography, and when we are dealing with intimate others, or photography exercised in an intimate space with intimate people, how the question of light play, and how the question of seeing somebody better, or the knowledge of somebody, can both work together conceptually, I thought. So these are photographs of people who are from the gender minority community in the eastern part of India. And these are photographs where these photographs have been framed very consciously by their friends, which I helped facilitate in this workshop. And this framing of how they see one another, and also how one sees being seen by the other, and the question of being in the margins of society, and where they might not be aware of the fact that they are in the margins, but their friends perhaps know how they are, how best is to represent them. So this work kind of talks about this kind of interplay between seeing the person who are close to, and basically photography and friendship and camera. And again, this brings me to the core question of my work, which is about how my photography is about the incantations of lives that have touched mine. So these are also lives that have touched mine in some very special way when this workshop was conducted. And this is a presentation of that work, I think. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Well, thank you all for that sort of overview and insight into your practice. I mean, I think there's so many different directions we can go from this. I mean, I'm really interested, maybe to begin with, Phalguni, again, you mentioned the sort of ways in which the camera is instrumentalized, and how, when you were thinking about the show, you were thinking about artists who provide some sort of agency, either for themselves through self-portraiture, or for the other people they collaborate with through the pictures. And what I'm really struck by is the way in which, for all of you, it seems the sort of effective possibilities of photography rather than the sort of documentary ones, although you are, right, Marvel, you're documenting yourself, but really it's about the sort of interiority and the things that the camera can't necessarily capture. Or Siddhartha, right, you're collaborating with other people, but even, right, this idea of darkness and the way in which the camera can't penetrate everything, right? And this sort of tension between what is visible and what is not visible, but really through emotion, right, through the connection with other people. So I'm just curious about, for all three of you, just this idea of affect and the sort of other sort of potential of photography beyond this sort of documentary uses, and the way in which feeling plays such a really important part in all of your work.
I've spoken a lot, so maybe Marvel, do you want to start?
Yes, that's all right. Well, I'm yeah, jumping in what you said is last about feelings. Actually, when I grabbed my camera to take self-portraits, and it was especially at the beginning of my project, then I didn't even know that it would become a project. I think that's also what I have in common with Siddhartha, is that I am not a photographer who works project-based. But I grabbed my camera to capture those feelings that I found hard to describe in words what I was feeling. As for example, the portraits that you see on the left right now on the screen, I didn't know in words how to tell what I was going through. So I found it important to capture that moment and use that image as sort of, as my voice, actually. Yeah.
And or Siddhartha, you can jump in if you want.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Drew. Yeah, feelings play definitely a big part in my photography, and it's always to do with if I don't feel I don't pick up my camera unless I feel like certain strong emotion inside me to photograph somebody. And again, this happens only when by happenstance or what have you, like I keep encountering people over period of time, and time and trust and everything kind of builds together to build these kind of feelings inside you, and to photograph somebody, to be touched by someone's lives, and to be feeling fortunate that these lives have been shared with you, and I've been able to witness, or I've been able to be part of those lives. I don't know in time where we all stand in the next decade or so, but I just feel like time is running out in some way, but whatever time I have got, and with that feeling, and if I'm really moved by something. With Monorama, I was very moved. So was I with this workshop that I was conducting. So yeah, these are personalities that kind of cross your path, and I feel very fortunate to have cross paths with them. So that's how I see it.
And Phalguni, maybe it relates, you started out talking about this idea of the crack. And I think about, right, that crack being something other, right? Some potential that seems effective, right? It seems maybe bodily or more emotional.
Yeah. I mean, for me, one of the ways that I thought about this show was definitely the crack, and whether these images, like Marvel said, they are his voice, and it's very much the same emotion for this light table that we're seeing here, right? Which is, as Siddhartha said, it's been framed very consciously by the sitter's friends. So they chose how they wish to see their friend, and so there's by letting these kind of small slippages happen in perception, right? Where in the making of a photograph, the framing by your friend becomes such a crucial device. Or with Soumya, when his collaborators share with him his dreams, and that act of sharing a recurring nightmare or a recurring vision that you have, and then getting photographed in that, is a very small gesture. But then it's also, it's like the crack through which the light gets in, and you see a facet of someone's identity that you wouldn't have seen otherwise, right? And so the crack is definitely one of the ways in which I'm thinking about the affective nature of photography, like you said. But another way I'm thinking about it, which has emerged in this conversation, is when Siddhartha was talking about darkness, right? And what for me is very interesting for all these photographers, what they're doing in relation to the crack, is that there's a refusal in all three of them to accept darkness as a state of fecundity, right? And we were talking about this before our call as well, that when you're in the dark, and that could be a darkness that you feel to yourself, perhaps you're not comfortable revealing parts of your identity to the larger world around you, which is the case for a lot of the people from regions where Siddhartha and Soumya have photographed. So you may not be comfortable to reveal parts of your identity to the world, or sometimes you may not know parts of it yourself and remain in darkness about it. But at the same time, like Siddhartha said, can darkness be an alternative state of knowledge, right? Can darkness itself be a crack through which the light of photography gets in? And it's very interesting for me, as a curator and a thinker, to talk about these terms, because photography is to write with light, right? So how do we let that light enter the crack? How do we let it enter a space of darkness? And can that space of darkness also be a state of knowledge? So that's what I was thinking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and that sort of leads me to another question I wanted to ask, which you mentioned in the beginning, the sort of relationship between image and text. And of course, you started out with the poem, which is included on the wall. But I'm really interested that none of the works incorporate text, right? That there's this, again, this sort of, and maybe related to this idea of darkness, or this sort of resistance to the ways in which the camera is often used, that there seems to be in all of your work, or sort of poetics, right? That resists the sort of literal transcription, either of the thing you're photographing, but also fixing the meaning of the image in relation to text. And I know, Marvel, your book includes text, so I'm just curious about, how you approach incorporating text, or, in an exhibition versus a presentation in a book format, where a reader can maybe sit longer with the work and go through it and read text at a different pace. So yeah, I'm just curious about all three of your thoughts about the sort of not including text, or how you have incorporated text into your work in the past.
I could also talk a little bit about my book, which is called Marvel. There I did include text, and I did this at the very end of the book. And why I chose to put it at the end is because I find it important for people with a book, to sit down with it, go through the story, but first feel yourself, like what are the images, what are they doing with me? What do I feel myself? And I think when you put text next to an image, then you also navigate the viewer to a certain point. And that was something that I didn't wish. So that's why I decided to put the text at the end of my book. And I think here for this exhibition, we decided, or together with Phalguni, to not incorporate any text. Also to, because I think for this exhibition that works best. Maybe Phalguni can.
Yeah, I think, it's so interesting, Marvel, you mentioned that your book has the text at the end, whereas the way that we were doing the layout of this exhibition, the text is right at the start. But at the same time, it's not a directive text, right? And poetry has always been a really important thread that ties exhibitions together for me. And I wanted to start on that note. And like you said, Drew, there is already a great deal of lyricality in these works, in each of these works. They're all they each speak in a very poetic tone. So so for example, if I look at Siddhartha's, that triptych image on the central wall, you see a story unfolding in it, even without me having to put a curatorial text and telling you that these images were of a performance artist in Eastern India. She's transgender. I felt like, yes, those are important factual points, which are, of course, accessible to the audiences. But at the same time, like Marvel said, what are these images doing to me? And the story that they're telling on their own, and the way in which the rhythm in which they're telling it is so powerful that I didn't feel, I think, like Marvel said, collectively, we didn't feel that there was a need for text to frame that show. But at the same time, it's, as curators, that's always a kind of, like I said, the interstice that you have to navigate. And for me, the way that I see it in my practice is that I let the work do the talking, and I let the work lead the way. And these are all works that spoke to me in very, I mean, this is a conversation we had when we were also looking at Siddhartha's images. If you could go to slide 15. Yeah, thanks. So, you know, even the fact that we decided in Siddhartha, maybe you can chime in a little bit here as well, when we decided that it has to be a light table, right? And Siddhartha was very clear with me, if I may say so. He said, I don't want to show these images on a very large scale. They're very intimate works for me. These are people that I've had a really close relationship with. And he said the effect that he wanted to create would be as if the rush of knowledge, because he was thinking about knowledge and darkness and knowing somebody in the darkness. He said it should be like the rush of knowledge sitting on your shoulder in a library, right? So if you're thumbing through the archive of, say, the Metropolitan Museum, that's what it should feel like. And we were quite conscious of making these images illuminative then, right? Because they're images that are talking about darkness. So just that, I think through those kind of gestures curatorially and through those kind of interventions, you can make the work come alive and you can make the work sing. And it doesn't always have to be done by wall text or an exhibition information on the side, which I think now we're moving towards a way that it can be made accessible to viewers differently. So as a curator, I find this kind of thinking with artists much more interesting as to ways in which to just activate their work, right? And that's why I thought a good example would be Siddhartha's light table.
Yeah, and to remember Susan Sontag's quote of where she says, "My library is an archive of longings." So I personally feel like I wanted to create a way of viewing this work as they were being made. So they were being made and in a very intimate space, which is very safe, and some of the people you see in this photographs may not. I don't think some of them are not alive anymore. So I just wanted to keep this confined within this box and like just have people come up to it and see them at a distance also, which I felt if you make the photographs small and intimate, I think it brings the viewing, the way the audience will view it is also in an intimate way. So I personally felt that's one of the reasons I wanted to present this work in this manner. So.
And if I may just say so, because we're talking about language, Drew, when you said about image and text, what's really interesting for me is that Siddhartha calls these works photo poems, right? So I'm also interested in how images itself have a textual quality. And for him, this is because we were thinking again in terms of space and exhibition design, and we thought, okay, how big is the table going to be? How many images do you want to show? What's the edit going to look like? And these are the kind of questions we were having with each other. And he said to me, I want to build this sequence like I would write a poem. And maybe this is for him the first line of that poem and from that larger body of work. And that's how the couplet grows and becomes, like the poem on the wall. It says, "We can live and we will." So that's really the essence of the show for me.
Right, and it sort of leads me to another question, which is related to maybe everything we've been talking about too. But yeah, I'm interested to hear from Siddhartha and Marvel about this idea, again, going back to agency. And we've been talking a lot, obviously, about the sort of production of images and, right, the sort of agency of the makers. But I'm also interested in, right, we've sort of shifted to the idea of reception of the images. And, right, obviously, we can't control the way in which various viewers might view these images. So I'm also interested, when you were making the work, if you were thinking about different strategies that sort of signal that agency, or how you thought about it, how that agency is is pictured in a way that, represents that agency, or is that something you're less concerned with? You just sort of allow either yourself or a collaborator to make the picture, and are unconcerned maybe with how that image might convey agency?
Good question. To be honest, I don't think about it a lot. I think everyone that looks at an image, it's every image out in the world, everyone has their own thoughts with it. So you can hope for someone to see it the way you are seeing it, but you never know how someone is viewing it. And what I found most important with creating this work, that I wanted to be really truthful to myself and honest with myself, and that was my biggest motivation, to capture honest work or create honest work. And I didn't think a lot about how others would perceive it, or And there's also, that just came up in my mind, is that something that I find really important. That's a question I ask myself a lot, is how do we see each other for each other? And I also think that without text, with this, besides the poem, but like other text, if you would put something about transition or gender on the wall with it, then that's the first thing you think about when looking at the work. But without it, you are really looking at what you're seeing, like a person, and you're going to start thinking about the person. So then you really start seeing that person for who he, she, or they is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, again, like the not including the text, right, it sort of allows the work and the images to resonate on multiple levels. It doesn't sort of fix the meaning of the images or the people who are pictured in them. Siddhartha, I'm curious about your...
Yeah, for me, as I had mentioned earlier, that, for me, time is a big element in my practice, along with trust. And together, that makes me, that helps me release the narrative and have the narrative go on its own. And I have seen this with my practice, that when I am photographing somebody over a period of time, and these are places like for the Monorama project as well. These are photographs taken in a very close community spaces, and it's not like you can just I felt like I was very privileged to be in those spaces, and somebody to allow me, like Monorama allowed me to be in those spaces, and she played an active role of how I go about my photography, like documentation or what have you, however you want to frame it. She played an active role in my participation in that, as much as she participated in these photographs being made by me. So for me, this act of faith in me being in that space that she showed is perhaps a marker for the agency she has shown in making of these photographs, or the creation of these photographs. I just happened to be there, and I was quite fascinated, and over time this trust just built, and the narrative without the project approach, it built on its own, and I still am going back at it. And so this is where I think agency can play a big role if you give it time, and there is a active participation of the people you're photographing.
Great, thank you. Well, I know we're coming up on the 40 minutes, and so I encourage anyone who's watching to submit questions. Otherwise, I thought maybe, you sort of hinted at maybe other things you're working on or returning to some of these communities. And I know both of you said you don't work on a sort of project basis, but I am curious, as we sort of wrap things up, to hear just what you're currently working on, whether it's another curatorial project, Phalguni, or other sort of projects, books that are coming up.
Thank you. I'm currently working on taking this show to other venues because I think it's important to get the word out and get more eyes on the beautiful conversation that Siddhartha, Marvel, and Soumya have started. So that's definitely a part of my planning at the moment. But in my larger practice, like Jill said in my introduction, I'm interested in the inner lives of things, of women, of everyday objects. And I'm interested in the interconnected histories of the global South. So that's another aspect of my practice that I'm building in future exhibitions. And I'm doing so while continuing my dialogue with these three wonderful artists, two of whom we have on with us today. Yeah. And I know Marvel is also continuing his Inner Journey series, and it has, I believe it may or may not have a new title now. He'll be able to tell you.
Now, I'm still continuing my Inner Journey series, and it doesn't have a different title yet. Yeah, like Phalguni said in the beginning, that I often say like my emotions are constantly in flux. Which I wanted to focus on now, but it's still not project based. So when I feel it, I grab my camera, but if I don't feel it, I won't. It's to focus on life after the bodily transition. During the pandemic, I struggled a lot with my mental health again, and I had 2 cats, and I grabbed my camera again to take self-portraits, but my cats were coming in the frame, and I was like, hey, what are you doing? Go away. But then I started to observe my cats and look at them like, hey, why are they actually coming towards me right now? Is there are they mirroring me? Or so my cats made me aware of my own feelings, and even better, and they started to help me. So I started to capture them as well. So it's a project more focused on the relationship between animals and people, and if animals can help people live mentally healthier lives. And that's just I don't know yet a project title, or that's it will come or not, or but I'm working on it.
Thanks. Yeah, as a fellow cat lover, I can say I'm excited about it. But I'll let Siddhartha chime in on the expansion of his I See You Better in the Dark series.
Yeah, so if you ask me, this was a revelation for me because I wanted to see these images as photo poems, this series coming together. So I'm sitting with the archive of these workshop images, and I'm hoping to, build more such lines. Like, this is perhaps just the first line, and I'm hoping to follow up with several other lines, and maybe have something in the future to present as photo poems of these images. And apart from that, I'm doing other projects, but it is not project centric. It's something to do with a friend of mine who wanted to collaborate with me with his images from a city that I work from, and so we wanted to collaborate our images together and make a book about it. So we are heading in that direction, towards looking at the archive, looking at the photographs, working towards it. So if you ask me, yeah.
And the book is on Calcutta, one of the most photographed cities in
India. It's also very difficult because it's one of the most photographed cities in the world, and so it's always making me slow down. Like, whenever I'm seeing it, I'm going back, looking at his images, trying to bring an edit together. So it's a very difficult process I've been engaged in, to be honest. So, but yeah, and I'm hoping to come up with something more, something that is going to be meaningful for both of us, and maybe for the rest who are going to view it. So
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing how this show might evolve, and hopefully I hope it does travel and that you can share it with many more people in person. And I look forward to seeing, how all of your projects develop. I just want to thank you again for sharing your work and your time with us today. And it's been a pleasure to get to know you all a bit. And I wish we could have done this in person, maybe one day. And encourage everyone who's tuning in to go to Baxter Street and check out the show.
thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Drew and Phalguni and Marvel and Siddhartha, for giving us such a very engaging conversation and allowing us to go deeper into the work to celebrate this poignant and important show. And yes, please come to see Just Wide Enough to Hold the Weight. It's open until June 8th, and we're at 126 Baxter Street. And we would love to see all of you here and give you a walkthrough to this really exquisite show. Thank you all for your time and your energy and your amazing work, and allowing us this space to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Jill.
very much.